Okay, what about the memory verse? This is where the rubber hits the road. No, it does. There's a verse, Colossians 1 verse 16. Okay, so would you like to, well, let's say it together through, and then we'll ask if there's somebody that's going to be brave enough to say it, that have learned it. Okay, let's read it. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. Colossians 1 verse 16. There's so many things in there, it's hard to keep track of the order of them, isn't it? So who's going to volunteer to say the verse? I'll go back one. Who's going to volunteer? For all things were... Go on, for
all things were... By him were all things created, both in heaven and on earth, whether visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him.
Give him a hand! Very good. You'll be able to set that to music, classical music, that verse. There you go. Good on you. Anybody else want to have a go? Anyone else? Anyone else? You get a chocolate. Now that's a bit of encouragement. Chocolate. If I could remember everybody's name, Okay. Anyone else? Well, let's just say it once again. Okay. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and on earth, the visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. Colossians 1 and 16. Very good. Well, I hope it's been an encouragement to you, an opportunity just to share and just discuss things which you don't get very often. So it was great going down the beach yesterday, wasn't it? Going for a walk and walking along. You had to go along a grassy path to sort of get there, and quite amazing. I don't know if you saw what I saw there. It was this. As I was walking along, I saw this in the grass. Did anybody see that in the grass? I am kidding, I didn't actually see it, but I saw this in the grass, and I thought to myself, wow, we had rain last night, but I didn't realise we had a thunderstorm. There must have been a lightning bolt that hit this part, and it connected the grass and the leaves and the sand together, and look what it formed. Isn't that incredible? About time. That's right. Has anybody got a second joke about that? There you go. So, isn't that interesting? There's an argument that goes back a long way to a guy called, I think it's William Paley, but I think it's William Paley, who wrote about the evidence for God, the fact that we know there's a God because he used the watch that he found in the grass, found somewhere, and he says, if you find a watch, you know there's a watchmaker. So that was his argument, and it was a very powerful argument from design, William Paley. And that reigned until about the time of Darwin. And so we just touch on that today. And that argument in our culture today has been overturned, but it's not valid. So the question is there any evidence that God created? I was talking to somebody yesterday and they talked about evidence and how do we know that it's true. So is there any evidence that God created? And the evidence is in what he has made. I read a story about a guy, his name was Daniel, he lived in England, and he was coming into the little village that he was at, or the little town that he lived nearby. He was an atheist, and he was wandering in to have, just to meet some friends and have a bit of fun on a Friday night. And when he was coming in, there were some guys standing up who were preaching in his town, and they did it every Friday night, but he was not interested in it at all. But as he was walking past them, he sort of just had this curiosity thinking, I wonder what they look like, these guys, what's driving them? And so he just stopped, paused and just sort of looked, at them, and one of the guys was standing up, and he had a picture, of a camera, and on this picture, he said, "Who made that?" And so there were some people standing around, and they said, "Fuji." He said, "That's right." You don't see these days. People use their cell phones, of course, but people still have digital cameras. You know, the really good photos by the digital cameras, which are a bit bigger than a cell phone. But anyway, they saw it, and they said, "Fuji." And he said, "Yeah, Fuji make it." It was the engineers and the technicians and all the people that are involved in Fuji. They designed it and they made it. He talked a little bit about the details of this camera, about the lens and what was necessary to make it do a good picture and not have colours sort of going astray, and the shutter, that it has to be the right speed, and he talked a little bit about the design of this camera. So this guy Daniel was standing there watching, it sort of caught his attention, and then this guy put up this picture like this, and he said, "Who made that?" And of course it's a human eye, and if you compare the human eye, what the human eye can see, with a camera, which is obviously designed, and so the human eye has obviously been designed, and not only that, it is a much sort of more incredible specifications in a human eye. And Daniel said, in the space of a moment, he said, "I went from being an atheist to believing in a creator God and being in awe at his creation." And so that's exactly, you know, evidence for God. God is, he doesn't sort of blast it out from the mountaintops. He doesn't come over loudspeakers, but it's there all the time. The evidence for God, the evidence that he's created. And we read in Romans chapter 1 about this. And it says in Romans chapter 1, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen." Isn't that amazing? His invisible qualities have been seen. Isn't that incredible how it puts that? His invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And so the evidence that there's a God is in his creation. He's provided evidence for us in his creation. And another sort of a little throwaway line that you can use if people are looking for evidence is basically you can say, well, if you go into an art gallery and you see a painting, that is evidence that there's a painter. The painting is evidence of a painter. And you can understand a little bit about what the painter thought. You know, even though you don't know him, even though you've not met him, you can understand a little bit about his abilities and the things that he was interested in through what he's made. So the painting is evidence of the painter. Or another evidence that you can use, these are really good lines. I've used them quite a few times and there's some interesting stories. But you've got a building. The building is evidence of a builder. There's a builder, even though you haven't seen the builder, and the builder might have been passed away 100 years ago, the building that's there is evidence of the builder. And so creation is evidence of the creator. Isn't that cool? And we could go into a lot, and it's really fascinating to look at the amazing design evidences in creation. And I'm just going to touch on a couple, but there's lots and lots of them which are fascinating, which are amazing, of his divine nature. And one of them, I mean, is birds, flying. Birds, you know, the amazing ability of birds to fly. It's taken us, man, it's taken people thousands of years to be able to make things which fly, to make airplanes. 1907, I think, was the Wright brothers, something like that. And from when they discovered how to make engines and get power, it took a long time before they could get powered flight, because there's so many things involved in being able to fly. And here we've got this amazing eagle, and just look at the way its feathers are turned up. And some of the modern aeroplanes have these features on the ends of their wings, and the idea is it's to get rid of these vortices which are over the edges of the wings. And look at the way it's got its tail, and it's stable, and it can come in just in an instant. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? the amazing evidences of birds, and that's a big bird, really big one. But you see some little birds like that. It's just amazing when you sort of see a little bird that's got blue colourings on it and it gets in the bush and it flits around here, there, and it feeds, and you think about it, incredible. It's not only able to fly, it finds its own food, it's got the energy, and it's able to make a nest, and it's able to have little birds, and then it's incredible how that works. But then here's another amazing evidence of the Creator God, and it's in the oceans. There's amazing stuff in the oceans. I think of this. You look at this in the ocean, and it's sort of it's like glistens. It's got this blue colour, a jellyfish. It's really, really fascinating, isn't it? And it's got these things that trail behind it, which make it look very attractive, don't you think? And then on the ends of these little streamers, it has little cells on it, little specially designed cells, and this is what they look like. If it comes up, hopefully it'll come up. There it is. There's a cell. It's got design on the inside of the cell. It's got a nucleus, and it sits there, and it's got a little trigger. And if something brushes against it, it shoots out a stinging thread into whatever it brushes against, which might be a human. Has anybody here been stung by a jellyfish? A lot of people have, and you know what it's like. Is it a pleasant feeling? No, not very pleasant. And so here's a guy who got stung with it pretty badly, and on his arm. Look at that, eh? So there's evidence of design. Evidence of design. You see the evidence of design? And that raises a question. What's the question that comes out of that? Why are there bad things in the world? If God is good, why are there bad things in the world? Do you have a question yet? No? Okay. If you had, that would be fine. And of course, that's the big question. And if you're talking to somebody about Christian things, about God, about the Bible, if you mention going to church, that is often a question that comes up. And it's not just jellyfish, which have these stingers on it. There's a lot of things. There's the brown snake, which is poisonous. It's the most poisonous snake in Australia. You wouldn't want to get bitten by that. There's crocodiles, which will grab you and roll over and drown you and then eat you. There's a lot of bad things in the world. There's lions which attack you, rip you apart, and you see this stuff in the world. And so if there's a God is good, why are there bad things in the world? And so this is one of the issues with the design argument. And of course, we talked about it yesterday, about the fact that we live in a broken world. Our world is broken. And we talked about how it was Adam and Eve took the fruit, they disobeyed the Creator, and He commanded them not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they disobeyed and ate it. And then there was a curse placed on our world, and we live in a cursed and broken world. And we see it on the news. I was just thinking about the war that's going on over there in Russia and Ukraine. And I was just thinking it's been going on basically most of the last year. And there's something like in Ukraine, something like 150,000 people, soldiers, have been killed. You think, what a broken world. Why does God allow this to happen? And of course it's because we live in a broken world, and that's why we sang about the redemption that comes in Jesus Christ. We need a redemption. And so we talked yesterday, and it's also in your notes, about the 7 seas of history. And this is the key to understanding the world, understanding where we fit in things. It's a creation. The fact that Jesus made us. All things were made by Him and for Him. And then there's a curse as a result of sin. That's the impact that sin has in this world. And we see it all the time. And then there's the catastrophe of Noah's flood, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And this is how we sort of connect the world we live in with the Bible. It's a key to understanding that. And then there's a confusion of the Tower of Babel, the fact that we're all one family. And then the covenant with Abraham, the promise of the coming Messiah, Jesus coming, dying on the cross, which we sang about today. And so according to, the idea of evolution, is that, Well, according to what the Bible says, is that basically death and suffering came in as a consequence of man's actions. It was sin. And that's the really big thing for all of us to understand, is the effect of sin on our lives, on the lives of others, and on the lives of the world. And then, according to evolution, here it comes, is that death, disease, and suffering have always been around. That's just the way it is. Get used to it. We live in a world where things don't work properly, because, that's the way it is. Death, disease, and suffering over millions of years. And of course, we read in the Bible about how that can't be right. When we start from a biblical point of view, that can't be right. And so the key there is to explain the dead fossils, and Noah's flood is what explains it. We're going to deal with that tomorrow. And so the ark carrying capacity, and we're going to be looking at that. And I like that. I just hope everybody else does. I'm sure you will as well. So we're talking about design, and there's a lot of stuff that comes out of this, and questions. And if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to put your hand up and stop me. But I was really pleased yesterday. Who was it? Young lady here somewhere said she had to put her shoes on late, and they were shoes which had laces on them. And it was a major drama to get the shoes on her feet and laced up. That right? It was really cool, wasn't it? But I like these Velcro strips. George the Mestral is the guy that invented these Velcro strips. And so you just slip them across and they're done up. And the way it works is this, is that he used to like going for a walk through the mountains. He lived in Europe, and the beautiful mountains and beautiful views and the grassy mountains, grassy hills. And but there was a plant that grew in those areas called, did we go past 2? Come on, go back. We're not locked up, are we? The burdock plant. The burdock plant. That's the plant that was there. That was in there, and it had these flowers, and it had all these hooks on it. And he took his dog for a walk through the mountains. But every time when he came home, he had all these hooks in his trousers. And they were all through his dog's fur, and it would take him half an hour or more to clean it all up. And he sort of thought, what is going on with this? Why do these things get attached in here? And it frustrated him. But as he looked at these hooks, he came up with an idea. And that's what he invented Velcro. And that's what Velcro's like. It's got these hooks down the bottom, and it's got the stuff like the trousers, the material at the top. And you push it together, and the hooks catch in, and it makes a seal like that. And so Velcro, when you do your Velcro up, you realise that God thought of the idea first. As most things that we invent are like that, God thought of it first. And Velcro's even gone into outer space. Here's a guy playing chess, and we don't have a problem with chess here, but in space you have a problem, because there's weightlessness. So you put a piece on the board, and if you've not got anything to hold it down like gravity, it will float through the air, through the interior. And so you've got to have everything stuck down, and they use Velcro to stick it down. So that's just an example of design. A simple thing like a prickle bush. How the design is there. The aim of the prickles is to attach to things that move, to animals, and to spread those prickles right throughout the area, and to plant new seeds. And this inside the prickle, it's not only got a hook on it, but it's got all the information to start a new bush. It's all in there, and it'll grow. Isn't that incredible? We've not been able to invent anything like that. Now, why don't scientists believe? If there's, there was this argument from Harley's watch, the watchmaker, and the evidence for design is so strong in our world. Why don't people believe it? That's because there's another story about how we got here, and that story is the idea of evolution. And so Richard Dawkins, I don't know, has anybody heard of Richard Dawkins? A few people have. He's sort of gone out of the flavour for a while, but he used to be front and centre for a couple of decades, the books that he wrote and that. So Richard Dawkins, he's written a book called The Blind Watchmaker. Do you get what he's aiming at? The watchmaker. Haley's watch. Haley's watch is the thing that shows that there's a designer, and he's written a book called The Blind Watchmaker. There's no designer, it all happened by blind chance. See how he's aiming that? And he says this, the fantasy of evolution, he says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Isn't that incredible? They're complicated and they give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So could you present him with evidence for design that would make him change his mind? He wouldn't change his mind because he's already made his mind up that it only gives the appearance of being designed. You know, and it only gives the appearance that there's a purpose behind it. But there's not because of evolution. And so the idea of evolution, this is a diagram of sort of the big scheme of things. It starts with here, the first living cell, which just popped into existence. We'll talk about that. And then over millions of years, you know, it evolved. It evolved into fish and then evolved into amphibians and frogs and then to reptiles and mammals and eventually people. That's the story. It's a narrative. So there's no watchmaker, there's no designer behind it. It's just natural processes. It's just survival of the fittest that's brought this about, and that's taken over our culture today. And so there is no God, you know, and we just make up our own rules. We do whatever we like. So this part here, see, you're going to have that replicating original first cell. How do you get that? I mean, you can't even start unless you have got a cell, a living cell that can reproduce itself. It has to not only be a cell that works, but it has to be able to reproduce itself. I mean, I've got at home, I've got a laser printer. And so I plug it in and it works, but it does not reproduce itself. You know, I don't come back in the morning and find there's some little laser printers that have just appeared and they're going to grow. I have to go to the shop and buy another one. See, but if this is a living cell that reproduces itself, okay, how does that even work? And so, like, but it's to find out to the source of all truth, we go to the Australian Curriculum Science Oxford Press, and it tells us how the first cell came about. I don't know if you've seen it. Has anybody sort of studied this or had to pass an exam in the first cell that you've had to do that? And did you find it hard? Find it hard to sort of pass the exam without sort of blowing your cover? But here it is. That's the diagram. Have you heard of that little experiment? It's called the Urey-Miller experiment, and it's got this piece of chemical apparatus, glassware, and so this is the put forward as explaining how life came about. And so if you look at it, that's what it looks like. You've got various gases in here, they get circulated around, it's hit with a spark, and then various things change and they get into the bottom, and it's heated here. So that's the idea of this Urey-Miller experiment. But you know, it's very cagey. I've looked at the book, the way it writes it, and it sort of writes it in a very sort of sneaky, roundabout way. They don't actually say this proves it. It's sort of dropping innuendos and ideas enough to sort of convince you and give you the impression that it's all sorted out. And they don't actually say anything misleading in this particular case, but it's very tricky. But when you look at it, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, the Urey-Miller experiment, basically, these are some of the things that are wrong with it. It's got the wrong atmosphere. There's no oxygen in an atmosphere. We've got oxygen in our atmosphere. We couldn't survive without oxygen in our atmosphere. You put oxygen in that and you hit it with a spark, you blow the whole thing to smithereens. And it's got the wrong organic chemicals. For example, I've got two hands. That's a right hand, this is a left hand. They're the same, but they're the opposite. You see how that works? A right-handed and a left-handed. And there are chemicals that are like this. Some of the molecules are right and left-handed. Life only works on a left-handed. I think it's a left-handed molecule. whereas this thing produces equal mixture of the two, and so that wouldn't work. Wrong chemicals, the wrong concentrations. There's not enough concentration of these chemicals to produce anything. It's got a hostile environment. It produces these things, and the environment is so hostile with aggressive chemicals that it breaks them down again. And then you need intelligent intervention to pull out the chemicals so they're not destroyed. And so most chemicals are missing for life. You know, you've got to have all the chemicals. The only way to get all the chemicals for life is that you would get a frog and you drop it into a blender. And there's all the chemicals for life. But the frog's not going to hop out of the blender, is it? So you've got all the chemicals, so the most chemicals are missing, and so chemicals are not life. Even if you've got the chemicals, you're not going to get the frog that's going to come out. You're not going to get a cell that's going to come alive out of it. And so it's like this. There's a guy, he's been working on this problem all his life. And look at all the formula there about the chemistry and all the glassware and everything, and he's looking at it and he's thinking to himself, he's thinking, if I can synthesize life here, I will have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form life in the beginning. Is that a little bit subtle for everybody? I don't know. Do you get it? Or is it just a dad joke? We'll see that. So, you know, this is something that's hidden, that people are not aware of. If given the impression that it just happens so easily. And so if life formed on Earth, it must have formed somewhere else in space. So there should be aliens around. Then they should visit us, because it just happens. It doesn't just happen. There's no way that life could form itself. You know, Richard Dawkins was on a video called Expelled. There's a guy called Ben Stein. He's got his head, looking at the back of his head. He's interviewing Richard Dawkins. And it's very interesting. He's talking about the origin of life. And he says, well, Richard, he says, so how did it all happen? How did it all happen? And so wanting for him to explain how life came about. And Richard Dawkins said, we don't know. And he says, we don't know? You don't know? He says, no, I don't know. Nobody knows. In other words, and he's not the only guy that says that, involved in this, that nobody knows how the first living cell could come about. And so that's just one evidence, the fact that there is a God who created. Who in the beginning was the God who created the heavens and the earth. So if you look at, say, a Airbus A320, any aeroplane, these amazing aeroplanes, and who hasn't ever been on an aeroplane? Is there anybody that hasn't been on an aeroplane? Quite a few haven't. Well, I just want to sort of warn you, like, when you go on an aeroplane, maybe this is not a good thing to say, but just think about this. Every part of the aeroplane, none of those parts can fly on their own. There's not one part of the plane that flies on its own. It's all made of non-flying parts. See? Millions of non-flying parts. Well, how does it fly? It's the way the parts are organised. That's what makes it fly. The engineers and scientists and that have put this thing together, and it's the way the parts are organised that it flies. And it's the same with a living cell. A living cell is made of billions of non-living parts, non-living molecules, billions of them. And they're organised, you know, into the cell membrane and into the nucleus, and there's highways that take along semi-trailers which are loaded with stuff, there's factories, and there's billions of non-living parts. And how come it's alive? It's the way it's organised. And so there has to be something to organise it, and that's what God has done at the beginning. So living cells, it points to two things, at least two things, but it points to intelligent design. I could put up some amazing stuff about the design of a living cell. When Darwin wrote his book, he just thought it was a blob, a sort of protoplasm. They didn't have the microscopes to be able to see it like we can today. But of course today we understand just how amazingly designed the machinery that's in it. So it's intelligent design, and it needs a sudden origin. It can't just assemble itself bit by bit. So it all has to be there. at once for it to be alive. And so it points to creation. So that's the first thing we're talking about, the evidence for God in living things, the amazing design in our world today. Now there's another thing that I want to talk about, is the fact that, evolution. So there's the first living cell, and we've got that picture of evolution, and the idea is that it's a natural selection, mutation and natural selection, which has brought about all the variety in the world that we see today. So here we go, it's coming up. And, I've had somebody say this to me when I was younger, and they say, I see evolution happening in my lab. He's a scientist, and I respect it in our church. And he said, I see it happening. You can't sort of deny it. You've got to be, it happens. I see it all the time. It's a fact. And so that would be like me. And it's sort of, I imagine that he sees these things that, come on, click, click, click. Is it coming up? Can you give it a push? Yeah. There you go. That's what I imagine, that you've got this, this microbe that's evolving into people. And I got the impression that he said, I see that happening all the time. But when in actual fact, all he sees is moths changing into different moths, different colours, different sizes. So it's not, there's two different sorts of evolution, and this is not the sort that you see. That's the sort you need. And I like to call it by a name like microbes to man evolution. Or bacteria to butchers evolution, or something like that. So that it's not just variation amongst moths. It's got to have these changes which provide the new information that's needed. And so evolution here, over millions of years, what we need is microbes to man evolution, from microbes here to man. And we don't see that. And so where does the information come from? It comes from the DNA molecule. You're probably familiar with that. It looks like a ladder that's been twisted up. And the DNA molecule's got information on it, letters. It's got 4 different letters. And so you can, that's Morse code, H-E-L-P. So the dots and the dashes are not the information. It's the way they're arranged. The dots and the dashes can be written on a piece of rope. They can come through a sound. It can, the way it's sent across a wire, that's the information, and DNA is the same. It's non-material. And in actual fact, there's thousands and thousands of books of information on our DNA that tells your cells how to make you. That's got the information. That's how amazing you are. Is it's got this information for how to make you. And DNA, for example, it's the ultimate information storage system. So just in a tiny little drop of DNA, just the smallest bit, there's enough to actually put books from the Earth to the Moon 240 times. Or, CDs, back when we had CDs, there's enough information to have a stack of CDs 1,000 kilometres high. There it is, 1,810 kilometres high. So it's a lot of information. That's what's in our cells. And so information in the DNA, like an amoeba, it's got all the information in the amoeba. It's like a book of information which explains how to make an amoeba. Right? You guess that makes sense? How to make an amoeba, and so that makes an amoeba. But if you're going to make, say, a horse, you need a lot more information. Would that be right? You have to have the information for how to make skin, how to make hair, how to make blood, how to make bones, it's a nervous system. You've got to have all this information, design information for how to make a horse, and so you're going to need a lot more information for how to make a horse. And so where does the information come from? There's actually no known process for how the information comes about. Now, if those that have studied evolution, did you ever see this example of the peppered moths? Who's ever heard of the peppered moths? Quite a few people. So this is put forward as an example of how evolution works. This is the scientific evidence that it's true and it's a fact, and anybody who denies it is an evolution denier, a science denier. So the idea is you've got these two moths. You've got it's called the peppered moths. You've got a dark one and a light one. And you can see them on the tree trunk. This is an experiment or a story that goes way back to the 1950s, still used today. Can you see the black one?
Yes, and I can see the other one.
Can you see the white one? There's the white one there. And so the story is, there's a story behind this. The story is that in England, these moths were sort of living happily there, and they would settle on the tree trunks, and the birds would be able to see the black moths, but not the white moths. And so they would eat the black moths, and guess what? There are a lot less black moths than white moths. Have you heard of that? That's the story, that's the way it goes. And then what happened is with the Industrial Revolution, or with all the factories and that went in, basically the tree trunks changed colour. They became dark. And so you can't see, can you see the white moth? You can see the white moth now. Can you see the black moth?
Yes, yes.
You can? Yeah, there it is.
It's down to the water.
There?
Yeah.
That it? Yeah? Good on you, mate. It's Ryan, isn't it? Yeah. So that's the dark moth, there's the light moth. And so now guess what happens? The birds, this is a story. The birds now are eating the white moths, and so you've got a lot more black moths now than you have white moths. Is that the story that you learned at school? That's the way it went? And that's pretty convincing, isn't it? That's evolution. That proves that evolution happens. Well, what have you got at the beginning? You've got black and white moths. What have you got at the end? Black and white moths. Nothing's changed. You haven't got anything new. It's just simply black and white moths. All that's changed is the some have been selected for. And so definitely we see this happening in all sorts of different animals. Selection, adaptation, they adapt to different environments. But we don't see new things happening. For example, here's an example of dogs. So, do dogs change?
No.
Do dogs change?
They change the size.
Yeah, what do they change into? Dogs. Different sorts of dogs. And so that's the ability to change. So some dogs can thrive in a cold environment, some dogs do better in a hot environment, and they adapt to the different environments. And so that's a design feature. That's the way God made our DNA, is so that we can adapt to different environments. Here's another example of, it says in Genesis chapter 1, God created the different kinds of trees, the different kinds of animals, the different kinds of fish. And Noah was commanded to take two of every kind of animal on the ark. So it's a kind, not a species. And so there's the horse kind. The zebra, the horse and the donkey, they can interbreed and they can produce offspring, and some of them are viable, able to produce other offspring. And this is an example. It's on the back of our creation magazine. A cross between a zebra and a horse. It's cool, isn't it? And it's called a zorse. A zorse. Don't you think that's cute? And you can, if you do look up that up on Google, you'll find all sorts of examples of this between a zebra and a horse. You can get a cross between a camel and a llama. It's called a kama. You can get a cross between a dolphin and a whale. It's called a wolphin. And so it's quite amazing. It's quite amazing how this happens. But it's not producing anything new. The information is already there. And so that's one of the keys. So I guess that's really one of the things I want to get across, is that it's put forward as if it's a fact, and it's very convincing. When you encounter it, it sort of makes you go, oh, but then when it is explained, you realize, oh, I get it. It's not evolution at all. It's not microbes to man evolution. And so the other evidence, this is the family evolutionary tree of life. Right, you start with a single living cell, and it evolves, to all the plants on this side, and all the fish and the lizards and that on that side. That's a fairly standard tree of life. But Charles Darwin and others, the big issue is, Darwin said this, why then is every geological formation and every stratum, why is it not full of such intermediate links? Where are the intermediate links between one thing and another? Where are the intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So that it's put forward, you might have seen examples of this put forward, of intermediate links to prove that evolution's a fact. And Darwin, when he wrote his book, he spent a whole chapter saying why there are not intermediate links. And for example, here we've got this evolutionary tree of life, and the intermediate links are drawn with a black line. Can you see that? There's no intermediate links that they can put in, and so they put in black lines to indicate how evolution happens. If you take out, just leave what is the facts there, and take out the stuff for which we don't have evidence, take out the black lines, what have you got? You've got what the Bible describes in Genesis chapter 1, which you looked at last night, we looked at yesterday. Kinds of living things, different kinds of living things. God created the different kinds. And so, how are we going for time? You're still alive, you're still awake. It's good. I'm amazed at how you stand up to it. You've got great endurance, you know, to be able to stand up to this, which is great. So we've talked about, let me have a look where we're at. Okay. So talking about these intermediate links. If you do a search on Google, you'll find there'll be sort of people, Google's just written by ordinary people. You could write a page on Google and stick it up, you know. You could write whatever you liked on Google. And not on Wikipedia, for example. And so if you go to Wikipedia and look for intermediate links, you'll get tables and tables and tables of all the intermediate links. It's just so convincing that it's overwhelming. But when you actually look at each one of them, if you've got the time to do it, you find that they don't really stack up. And so it's sort of like, they call it elephant hurling. You just throw this stuff out and it's all coming at you, and you say, I give in, I believe, you know, because they're just throwing it out and you don't even have time to think about it. But I'll just give you an example of elephant hurling, of how mammals on the land evolved into mammals in the ocean, right? So there's a mammal on the land and there's a mammal in the ocean. Right? And so they gradually change. Their legs turn into flippers, their tail starts to become a fluke, you know, and their feet become webbed. So this is just a drawing. You know, people put this up as a drawing, and when you see this, you're convinced, it's very convincing. But there's evidence for each one, like Rhodocetus. I'll take a look at that one. And there's a guy by the name of Carl and Debbie Werner. He was a medical doctor, and he wanted to sort of get to the bottom of this. So he and his wife travelled around the world, and they looked at all these different sites, different evidences for evolution, and he went to the guy who discovered Rhodocesus, or didn't discover him, who published about Rhodocesus. And so he's wanting to interview this guy. He's standing, just waiting to get in to visit him in his office, and he's looking at this display of Rhodocetus. And there's the Rhodocetus, the skeleton for it, and there's the evidence for it. And then he sort of looking at it, and he realised there's certain evidence that's not there. You know, he hasn't got any evidences for its flippers, and there's no evidence for that long tail, the fluke. There's no bones for the fluke. So this guy has made this big case, he's published a big scientific paper, he's become famous for this thing, it appears in all the evolutionary things about from one to the other, and the evidence was not there. So here's, for example, there's the evidence, see there's evidence up there, but nothing for the flippers, nothing for the tail. And so he just noticed that when he was waiting for him to go into see him in his office. And so what happened was he went in and talked to the guy, Phil Gingerich is the guy that's written all the papers about it, become famous for it, and he just sort of casually said, oh, I noticed there's you know, evidence for the flippers. Have you found any evidence for that since subsequent? What about for the fluke? Have you got any evidence now? And Phil Gingeric's just very calm. It's on DVD. This guy DVD'd the interview, videoed the interview, and he just very calmly said, "Well, no, we haven't found any more evidence. As a matter of fact, we don't think it had a fluke now. We don't think it had a fluke, and we don't think it had flippers." So here's a guy that discovered it, now sort of changed his mind because they haven't found the evidence. But the example is still there. You'll be able to find it, and it'll probably be taught at school. But so that's just an example of the sort of things that happen. What we do find is that we find that things stay the same. Rather than evolving, the fossils stay the same. And if horseshoe crabs, you see there's fossils of horseshoe crabs, see them well. And you look at modern day horseshoe crabs, they look the same. And they're supposed to be something like 450 million years since they evolved. They're not real years, but that's what they say. And 450 million years, and it hasn't changed. And you say, you know what they call that? They call that evolutionary stasis, as in stationary, stopped. So that's evolutionary, its evolution is change, so that's an example of change that doesn't change. Do you get it? So there's words for it which sort of make it sound really cool. There's another example, is a shrimp, and we find that this is what it looks like, you know, they find fossils of them, they look the same, 350 million years, and basically they're the same. And so the evidence actually points to things not evolving. I went where did we go? Up to the Daintree, I think, somewhere. My wife and I went, and we went on a tour. We had a look on the river, and they were talking about crocodiles. And it's interesting how you talk to these guys. And there was a guy who was sort of the tour guide. We were on this boat, and we were sort of sailing, you know, driving around, and we were looking at the crocodiles, and he was making this spiel, and he was saying, "Crocodiles are the most amazing animal." He said they reached their pinnacle, you know, 100 million years ago, and they haven't changed since. And I sort of said, they haven't changed? Why not? They should be changing if they're evolving. He said, oh no, they've just reached their pinnacle. And so this concept of things staying the same, which the guy talked about, doesn't seem to register, that it just undermines the whole thing of evolution. So the 7 seas of history, God created at the beginning. He created an amazing world. And all the different plants and animals, and they see the design in them, and we see his amazing ability, his forethought, his love. Did you talk about that last night? And the fact that he cares about us, he's provided for us. We find that in creation, the corruption. We live in a world where animals kill one another, and we get sick and disease, and there's wars, the catastrophe, the confusion of Noah's flood. And so this 7 seas of history is what ties it all together. And you'll find that this will be very helpful for you. If you get this in your head and be able to sort of understand the sequence of things, it makes a huge difference. And we got this guy, we have a Facebook page, Creation Ministries, and different people get on and make comments. This guy, Matthew Shaw, he got on, and he's just a young guy, he's very enthusiastic about creation, and he said, I've been reading creation stuff for years. He said, it's a lot of fun. And he said, I actually found that I'm acing Year 12 biology through what he reads on creation stuff, like a magazine. I think a lot of you get this, but it's always got stuff about natural selection and about DNA and evolution and microbes to man evolution. He says, I found that I've actually specifically evolution, that's what I'm learning about at Year 12 in high school, and I'm acing it. And he says, I seem to know more about it than my teachers. It's interesting, isn't it? You like that? You've got to be very careful that you don't offend teachers, but my granddaughter, she had to do a Year 12 assignment on evolution, and they were given a piece of evidence, and they had to show how this evidence proved evolution was true. They were not even given a choice to sort of whether this evidence supported evolution. They had to show that it proved evolution was true. And anyway, so my granddaughter sort of made a fairly open-ended conclusion about, you know, we really need more evidence. There's still lots of unanswered questions and that in her assignment. She said that. And so the teacher had commented on a draft and said, it's very good. I've learned a lot of stuff out of this. It's very interesting. And so the teacher learned stuff out of her assignment, but she said, you've got to improve the conclusion. So my granddaughter went forward and everyone else was working on their assignment in the class. And anyway, the teacher said, you've got to say that this proves evolution. You've got to not just leave it sort of vague like that. You've got to show that it proves evolution. My granddaughter's sort of standing there thinking, not knowing what to do, because she's put on the spot. I don't know if you have that happen to you. But anyway, the teacher said, you don't believe in evolution. What rock did you come out from under? She said, evolution's a fact. Evolution's a fact. And she's made such a fuss that all the other students are sitting up listening, watching what's going on. Anyway, my granddaughter, she ended up topping the class, which is quite amazing. So what I guess there's part of the lesson here is the, you know, I don't know if you've counted this stuff before or not, but I've put a lot of stuff up which you will probably encounter in your high school, and it'll give you a heads up to know that, hey, this is not all they crack it up to be. You know, and you'd be able to go and dig and find information and not be tricked. You know, it's a spiritual battle that's going on. And so one of the great resources to help you is the Creation magazine. Does anybody get Creation magazine? I think a lot of families do they? But this would be something to twist your parents' arm with if you don't get it. It comes out and it's just something you can have in your house, which is and something that's easy to read. We've had articles, Terence has put them on the tables around downstairs, right? And they've been cool. I've noticed people looking at them. And then the other thing is that it's really cool is the website. You find information there. Plus there's what do you call it? An email alert system which comes out, and you can get connected. I talked to some people here who said that they really appreciate that. It gives a nice digest of every couple of weeks of what's going on. And there's a lot of free material up the back. There's this one in particular. It's a little bit, I wouldn't say it's technical, but I mean, if you're studying at high school on this topic, you need to have a little bit of information. And so it goes into a couple of, one sheet of paper here about, do you know the difference? Can you tell the difference between evolution and natural selection? Evolution and natural selection. Can you tell the difference between the two? And then we also got articles about little brochures. These are free. There's a lot of these that are free here about Uluru, Earth's rock, how it shows the evidence for Noah's flood. And so that's the website. And what I'm going to do is make these available to you. I know you haven't got any phones here, mobile phones, but if you'd like to get the info bites, it comes out. I'll put these little pieces of paper, just put your name and postcode and email address on there. And you can drop it in that blue, great big blue milk carton up the back carton. And so fold it over, drop it in, and I'll make sure you get it. So that sound good? I'll give it to you in a while. And one other thing, this is it here. That's creatures do change, but it's not evolution. So this is one of the verses. This is your verse for tonight. Since you did so well in learning the verse from last night, I'm really pleased about that. Thank you very much, Timothy. That was great. Yeah, there's another one for you, Timothy, and everybody else. Romans 1 verse 20. So this is the evidence, you know, it's clear. You know, somebody might say, I'm an atheist. They're just saying that. Because this Bible verse says they know that there is a God. They just don't like him, or they're angry at him, or something, and they won't acknowledge him. And this one here says, let's read it together. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Romans chapter 1 verse 20. Good point. So thank you very much. I hope that's been a blessing to you. Tomorrow we're going to look at and a bit about the geology. We'll see where we go on that. It's all very good. And you've got the topics for tonight. Our world is amazingly designed. So I covered a lot today, didn't I? And I hope that's been good for you. Bless you, each one. Thank you so very much.